Philosophers talk to our times. The problems of prophecy. Being a prophet is a very strange business. Whether you're predicting the end of the world and the rapture of the saints, or merely a communist takeover. It's Dickens who, I think, puts it best. Of his character Affery, who looked like an idiot, but thought a house was haunted, but it was falling down. Affery, like many prophets, was better at her observation than her deduction. And that is surely the way with prophets. They notice things. They predict things. But more often than not, the prophecy doesn't occur quite as they understood it to be. And yet that does not make them totally wrong. Let us take, for example, two of the great prophets of modernity, who at the end of the 19th century predicted what the world would be. The first is that much maligned, subtle thinker, Marx. Now, I'm not going to get too far into Marx today, because I reserve him for another time. Beyond saying that when Marx was writing, aristocracy was still a thing. It could have been the case that the aristocrats were going to own all the mills, and certainly there were moves to buy them. One of his remarkable points is that he is noticing that that doesn't matter. That industrialization, or as he called it, one of the first people to call it, a revolution in industry, changed who had the power and why they had the power. And that power didn't matter. That change would be immaterial of whether the same people were in power. It is difficult sometimes when you're reading Marx from this position 120, 30, 40 years later to remember that an awful lot of what he predicted about capitalism, about mechanization, about the dominance of that it would give those that followed that and adopted it early was new to his day. Nobody had said it before. Nobody had the theory that pointed out that machines were going to take over the world. And so, yes, you can say, well, he was wrong. Communism didn't happen. To which I would say, well, the revolutions did. He was absolutely right about that. And he was right about the fatal affinity between mechanization that increasingly creates a dynamic of inhumanization and capitalism. I see no way that he is wrong. The time frames were just different. So, you have Marx then, and the idea that mechanization and rationalization was going to challenge systems of authority, shift them, make them otherwise than they were, on the one side. And on the other great prophet of modernity was, of course, Max Weber. Max Weber, writing in German, active as a politician and as a thinker, I think, until the 1920s. But his heyday was from 1890 onwards. So straddles both sides of the First World War. And was a writer of genius. It was he who wrote the book, The Procter & Work Ethic and the Rise of Capitalism. It's that guy. But he also wrote a lot about what he thought culture and society would become. And in this, he was moved by the assumption that modernity was going to be increasingly rational. We were going to move then into a world of rules, where best case scenarios were invariably followed. This was the world then of the bureaucrat, where effectively bureaucracy was increasingly going to be the power that drove what happened in a state. It was a dark vision, a sober vision, a vision that Sir Humphrey and Yes Minister would heartily approve of, a vision where bureaucrats ruled, because rules ruled. It's interesting. When I first heard about Weber, I would have been in my very early 20s and at university, and our professor Anthony Giddens at Cambridge gave this lecture on him. And the lecture was always that the Weber version was the one that was clearly coming to pass. Modernity was going to be all about following the right set of rules. So that was the late 1980s. And now, is that really what's happened? Over the last 40 years, there has been, of course, a movement away from the Keynesian model and the bureaucrats that it actually inspired. Because under Keynes, running an economy is as much an act of bureaucracy as it is anything. There's an efficient way to do it, and the efficient people do it efficiently. And of course, it hasn't happened. What's actually happened, Weber was right about the importance of information, but that information has been turned into a currency in its own right. But that's a recent phenomenon. Long before that, the bureaucratic model was, of course, replaced by the corporate model. And the corporate model is selectively blind because it doesn't care about humans. Weber might have been a depressed man, and he was, but he never envisaged a society where the reason didn't resolve around humanity and monitoring humans and making them as effective and as useful as possible. I think Marx would have had a word with him about that. Because the point about capitalism, of course, is that its darkness exists, in that in the end it doesn't value the humans. The point is that it values the capital, it values the money. And so the bureaucracy of capitalism is corporatism. Because what you are, of course, doing is maximizing profit. And you're maximizing profit at the expense of absolutely everything else. And so Weber wasn't wrong any more than Afri was wrong in his observation. We were going to enter into a period where the organization was going to have to shift and to change. But it was not the bureau, the office, that was going to be the model, but rather the corporation. It wasn't therefore going to be about following rules so much as breaking them, or rather creating organizations more powerful than states that didn't care a blind fuck about humans, that they cared about profit. So what they cared about involved selective blindnesses. Shareholders don't really want to know the truth, and that is the truth. Because the truth is they care about the money that they make from the corporations they invest in. What capitalism could do that Weberism could never do was to weaponize callousness. You see, in the Weber model, yes, bureaucracies are callous. They fill in forms, they define your lives. This is the world, the benefit of us, after all. And the world where the entire system is designed to slightly dehumanize you. And all of that has now just been taken into the corporate model. And we do it at work, and we get dehumanized at work. Why? Because it is the inheritors of Weber. It is trying to make you work, but it is not trying to make you conform now to a bureaucratic model, but rather to a model where money is glorified above all things and has to be glorified above all things. Because it is the axis of power. Weber, you see, would argue that a communist takeover would never have helped because that just increased the amount of bureaucracy. And in his day, he could cite examples already by 1920s. And he was, of course, right about that. But in a corporation, the accountancy and the accountability are given at the same moment. They're given in making money. It doesn't really matter what people are doing as long as you're pushing them and maximizing your profit out of them. You're monitoring them to make money. In later years, we've probably lived in a more Weberian society in the last 5 years than we did before. Why? Because now, of course, we are endlessly filling in forms. We're filling in forms of AI, which takes notice of us and turns our information into a currency that, again, the corporations can trade in. So that the dark vision of us being constantly monitored is once again true. But it is not being monitored by the state, it's being monitored by the corporation. And that's just the reality of it. That's just the world we live in. Weber was wrong, but he wasn't totally wrong. And any more than Marx was wrong. And those of you who are good committed Marxists will notice that the corporate model is close to one of the final forms that Marx predicts for communism. Because large corporations, he says, will try to do away with all competition. They will form a union, hugger-mugger, one with the other. a union in which all citizens are merely dependents upon them, as we are now dependents, kind of lessees of corporations. And in a world where we endlessly have to renew and are not allowed to own anything because the corporation owns things. It is a very pre-communist state. So Marx wins on that bit of these great prophecies of the future, it has to be said. But Weber wins on how dark this is, how dark this state is, how it is linked to information, how it is linked to the maximization of what you call reason, which is here understood as the maximization of profit at the expense of all other forms of humanity. It's an interesting situation. It's interesting that prophecies are both right and wrong. Tomorrow we'll consider the greatest play of all prophecies and how it allows one to navigate this.